Thanks so much, Chuck Morse, Left-Right Radio, every afternoon at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, right here live at Facebook and also downloaded to my YouTube account. So please subscribe on YouTube to get the daily program. My guest is C. Edmund Wright. He is a political commentator. He's a writer, an author, a columnist with Breitbart, Newsmax, and other venues. Edmund, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
My pleasure, Chuck. Glad to be here.
Now, just as a little background, you have taken on sort of what you might call the liberal rhino Republican establishment as headed by Karl Rove and the Bushes, and you've actually even had some direct contact, or shall we say altercation, not physically, but verbally with Karl Rove. So talk a little bit about what you've done in that area.
That's interesting. I didn't know you knew about the little run-in with Karl Rove, which is a funny story. I first learned firsthand about the Republican establishment in all of its sanctimonious glory during the 1992 Bush Quayle campaign. They were running against Clinton, Bill Clinton's first bite at the apple. Mm-hmm. And I was walked into the North Carolina Bush Quayle headquarters in summer of 1992 and said, look, I'm pretty good at saying why we're right and they're wrong, and I don't particularly like Bush, but I really am scared of Clinton. I'd like to volunteer. So, you know, they never turn away any volunteers, but of course nobody knew me. I knew nobody. And I said, look, I'm not great at raising funds, and I don't have any rich friends. You know, I'm not really skilled at stuffing envelopes, but I think I can help with communications. Well, one thing led to another, and I'll make this story quick. Within 2 weeks, I was North Carolina Bush Quayle communications director. And North Carolina was one of the 20 states that James Carville and George Stephanopoulos, names that are still with us, this was when they first came onto the scene, Chuck, as I'm sure you remember.
Right, sure.
And North Carolina was one of their 20 targeted states, and we were the only one of those 20 to pull out a win in North Carolina. Now, sadly, they won a bunch of other states, and the national election wasn't close.
Right.
But to get back to the Republican establishment, I ran up against John McCain. I ran up against a lot of the Republican office holders in Congress and some other Republican surrogates, and it was pretty clear who the establishment was. And even though it wasn't called the establishment then, or only by insiders, you know, because there was no internet, there was no talk radio except Rush. So this wide understanding of the establishment was nowhere to be seen really until just a few years ago. Now everybody knows it.
Right.
But I am proud to say that I was anti-John McCain in 1992, which I believe, Chuck, puts me about 8 years ahead of Rush Limbaugh on talk radio and about 16 years ahead of most Republican voters who finally figured that out in 2008 in South Carolina. But so this Republican establishment problem, which ties into the Frank Luntz focus group mentality and a whole lot of other things that I discuss in the book and in many columns, this has been a hot button for me for literally 25 years, 26 years now, I guess. So, yeah, this is in my wheelhouse.
You know, I think that people began to become aware, besides your work, Edmund, of this Republican rhino Me Too establishment right after the election of Clinton, when you had former President George H.W. Bush and others completely not only back but pushed through the NAFTA agreement and the GATT Accords, which is something that's anathema to conservatives and, by the way, to the far left as well.
Well, you and I might disagree a little bit about what a NAFTA and being anathema to conservatism is. I would say this: when I started to write the book, and I was going to write a book about the wave that ushered the Obama White House out of business in 2012. Of course, Mitt Romney's campaign managed to fumble the ball about 3 times coming down the stretch, and they lost. So the book, including the title WTF, was birthed the morning after Obama was reelected, with the horror of what the Mitt Romney, Karl Rove, Haley Barbour establishment had managed to lose an election to the most failed, president, the worst president in American history, with an Obamacare disaster looming, and and the economy just getting worse and worse. So that's when this was birthed. But the funny thing is, the first part of the book is a little bit of an introduction to the establishment, which, Chuck, today would not be necessary. Anyone who reads Breitbart, American Thinker, Daily Caller, any of these would fully understand now. But we've really just in, 5 years, the education of the voter has really gone into a whole new realm.
Well, because then along comes Donald Trump. And I think what happened is that his candidacy and his election, which shocked the establishment, exposed this rhino Republican establishment as actually being a bigger enemy to Trump than, the liberal Democrats, which we would expect, and the Clintons and whatnot. I mean, they're the ones who have their fingerprints all over this whole cockamamie, Russia conspiracy theory and the dossier and all this other garbage. They're really trying to. They're more than just opponents of Trump. They're trying to literally take him out of office.
Well, yeah, I think there's some of that. I still think most of that threat is from the far left, the George Soros left, which is what you expect. But yeah, this was what was ironic. Actually, in the book, and again, I wrote this in late 2012, and then it was published in early 2013 and debuted at CPAC in 2013. Mm-hmm. I actually almost predicted the rise of Donald Trump. And what I got absolutely correct was why he would rise. Now, I did not think then that he would actually get the nomination. And there were reasons why I opposed his nomination, although I clearly voted for him rather enthusiastically in the general and would again today. But I sort of predicted, and it's funny you bring that up because a guy messaged me through Facebook, I don't know, about 3 months ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. And anyway, he cut and pasted a whole long section on pages, I think 207 or 208 of my book about how I almost predicted it. I had forgotten that I was that prescient on it. But yeah, and this is the irony. See, I think that philosophically, the person most opposed to the Republican establishment was Ted Cruz. But when it comes to personality and attitude and really what the voters projected onto him, that candidate was Donald Trump. But it's interesting. Those were numbers 1 and 2. I mean, those two pretty much dominated the field by the time we got about halfway through it. And, of course, Trump much more so.
Now, I wanted to also get to your altercation with Karl Rove, the ultimate avatar of this liberal-leaning, Republican establishment. I mean, he was kind of the wunderkind behind George W. Bush. What happened?
Well, it was interesting. After the book debuted at CPAC in late February, early March of 2013, I think it was March that year. They keep moving it earlier, which is a dreadful thing to do in Washington in winter. But anyway, so it comes out in March of 2013. Well, shortly after that, and we shoot right up to number 1 and 3, our paperback and our Kindle version were dominating the election book genre at the time. That helped because we were out pretty quick. But it was announced that Karl Rove was going to be keynote speaker at the 2013 North Carolina GOP convention, which was in Charlotte. Well, I had very little real interest in the inner workings of party politics other than to observe it and comment on it. But, I told my wife, I said, we're getting a booth at that convention. And what happened is we had the little WTF buttons, which is just kind of a logo of the book. And there were 500 of them all throughout the convention, and they were everywhere. Karl Rove was aware of it. Haley Barbour was aware of it. Tom Tillis, who they were supporting in the primary at that time against Greg Brannon, who was more of a libertarian, base-leaning Republican for that Senate seat. He was aware of it. So it was an interesting dynamic. But to get to the funny part, Rove was given the keynote speech, and, that's the Saturday night thing in the main ballroom. You know how the goes.
Sure. Yeah.
So I wanted to give him a copy of the book. So I walk into the front entrance of this big ballroom, and I am not sitting and eating, and I'm not going to listen to Karl Rove. I know what he's going to say. But I figured he would come out from the dais while they were introducing him, and I would just try and catch him after the speech. Well, next thing I know, he just comes in right next to me and he's going to walk up with this big dramatic walk up while he's being introduced. So I said, I turned to him, and while he's being introduced by Robin Hayes, the North Carolina GOP chair at the time, I said, I understand you're a big reader, which I knew he and George Bush each tried to read a book a week, while they were in the White House.
Sure.
And he said, yes. And I said, well, I have something I think you might be interested in reading. And I started to pull it out of my briefcase. And he said, stop, never mind. I've read it. It's a poorly researched piece of trash.
Oh, boy.
Which, by the way, I put that on my landing page for the book. I figured that was the best endorsement I could get.
Sounds like you got under his skin.
Right. Well, and the funny part, Chuck, is that about that time, Robin Hayes was finishing his introduction. So as people, start the little golf clap as he starts to walk up, I said to him, I said, no, Karl. I said, your $400 million Romney campaign, that was a poorly researched piece of trash. And those were the last words he heard before the applause drowned it out. He gave
that's hysterical.
North Carolina GOP convention speech. True story. Couldn't make that up.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. And he's still at it. I mean, he's one of the #1 top Trump haters. Anyone but Trump. And meanwhile, Trump, for all of his faults, has proven to be a relatively conservative president, at least as conservative as Reagan.
Actually, I would say for all his faults, he has definitely proven a much more conservative president than we could have possibly imagined based on everything he'd said and done, everybody he had supported for 40 years, every public comment on the issues for 40 years. I mean, he was way left of the typical rhino Republican, let alone base Republican. And it's interesting, the left probably got the most Republican president, the most liberal Republican president instinctively than they could ever get. But their reaction, Chuck, has been so over the top. They have driven Trump to the right. I am firmly convinced of that. Now, I love it.
Right.
He's a lot more the president I wanted than he was while he was the candidate. But that's there's so many ironies from 2015, 16, and 17, and that's one of them.
It's an interesting one, and he, in the de facto sense, has proven to be the leader of a real conservative movement. And, with the keynote idea, the philosophical idea being putting America first, which may seem like a radical idea to the establishment, and it is, but it's a common sense idea, and it resonates with average people. Of course you put America first, just like you put yourself first.
What Trump was able to tap into that Ted Cruz was not able to, that Scott Walker was not able to, and even Marco Rubio, who's clearly disappointing about every other day, but then on the other days he's very good. But this anger that has been building up on everything from foreign aid and the whole BS deference game of diplomacy, which is basically diplomats lie more often than attorneys.
Right.
Usually in a situation, half the attorneys will be trying to get to the truth that no diplomat ever does. So I think this has been building for 30, 40 years. He came a little bit of the Perot, a little bit of the Buchanan. But what gave us a playing field that would allow Donald Trump to succeed was 30 or 40 years of both the far left and the Republican establishment, and nobody really listening to the conservative base, even if they don't think they're conservative, just kind of that base pro-American, just people who just want to live their daily lives. And Trump was able to tap into that far more than Ted Cruz was, even though I think philosophically and on policy, Cruz would probably be a little bit better. But Trump owned that environment that had been being created for 40 years, much of which Trump was actually helping create that environment. So that's another one of the ironies.
No, I mean, he engaged in plain speaking, and he's fulfilled it with direct policies that are not insane, that make sense. Things like, getting rid of the nuclear deal with Iran and getting, reducing illegal alien crossings at the border, reducing taxes, things that are.
Right, his reduction of the regulatory state is my favorite.
Yes, I love that.
Of the Trump presidency.
Absolutely.
But, another one of my topics, along with the Republican establishment for a long time, has been the cancer of the bureaucrats, these little people in the cubicles that we allow to retire at age 52 with full benefits. Meanwhile, we are paying them to destroy our businesses, destroy our home values, destroy everything.
Yep. They're not accountable to anyone. They're appointed bureaucrats who have usurped or have been given legislative powers by both federal and state governments.
Right, and Obama tapped into that with Obamacare and let them write most of Obamacare was written. We joke about Nancy Pelosi, and she deserves to be joked about with we got to pass a bill,
right, to find out what's in it.
But actually, in a kind of a screwy, sick way, there was a little truth in that, because once the bill was passed, then there's something like 100 pages of bureaucratic fiat for every 1 page of the bill. It now, metastasized through the system, and it'll be very hard to eradicate it. So, this is the thing, and maybe Chuck, you can give me some insight on that. Trump's refusal to take on the bureaucracy and to take on the IRS targeting Tea Party and all of that, that was one of my biggest disappointments with him in the campaign. So I was pleasantly shocked when he came out so strong against bureaucrats. And you know what's interesting? And I don't know exactly what the quote was, but he said he held some business roundtables shortly after he was elected.
Yeah.
And he said he was shocked to find out, and I believe shocked was his word, to find out that the business people were far more concerned over bureaucracy and regulations than they were even taxes, even though they were concerned over that.
Right.
So his rolling back the regulations, even if he didn't realize it till January of 2017 how important it was, all the credit to him for doing that, and then to help usher. He showed a lot more leadership on tax reform than he ever did on Obamacare. Quite frankly, he was disappointing on that, but he was a lot better on tax reform, been a lot better on regulations. Throw in Neil Gorsuch and Nikki Haley, and what?
Amazing.
I'm basically pleased.
Oh, yeah. And, I think you put your finger right on the real issue here, the one that's really transforming society, and the one that will be his long legacy, besides appointing good judges like Gorsuch and about 10 other federal judges to the bench, which they'll be around for decades. And that is the reduction of the administrative state. And that's something that Trump understands as a businessman, how intrusive that is in the ability of businesses to function, and plus, even personal life. I mean, there's all these, regulations that have seeped in. And then Obama represented just a continuation of this establishment. He even said on a program on NPR in Illinois that he would do an end run around the Constitution to implement things through, I forget the word, administrative fiat.
Yeah, that was he did the famous 2001 interview on Chicago Public Radio, where he talked about the negative rights of the Constitution, something like that.
Exactly. So here we are seeing what can only be described as, I would describe as a revolutionary change in this country under Trump. And revolution in the real meaning of the word, which is getting back to, individual rights, getting back to limited government, which was actually a reflection of the American Revolution. But we are now facing, and I wanted to get into this with you as well, the upcoming midterm elections. I'm wondering how successful, not just Trump, but the Republican, the good Republican Party, people like yourself, and people who understand the true import of this revolution, how we are doing in terms of communicating this message to people. Because when I look at the polls, like this morning when I took a look at the Drudge Report, there's a poll that says that the Democrats are 10 percentage points ahead of Republicans in the upcoming midterm election.
Yeah, and let's go back to tax reform just a second, because I think that's the key, not only on that policy, but also in how they handled it. The Democrats, I think, had that generic ballot lead, which is what you were referring to, of like 14 points or something.
It was 10.
Then, well, I'm talking about before tax reform was passed.
Oh, okay.
I think it was well above 10. I think it was 12 or 14. I'm just going off the top of my head.
Right.
But after tax reform was passed, and over the next few weeks, suddenly that thing was down to 3 to 4 to 5 points, because the reality of tax reform was sinking in and fighting the narrative of the media. Now, if Republicans go in with media polls showing them 3 or 4 points down in the generic ballot, they're going to win the House back. But see, this is this is what upsets me at both the Ryan McConnell establishment and at Trump himself, is they don't realize they need each other. They don't have to like each other. They don't even have to like the fact that they need each other. But that doesn't change the fact, Chuck, that they do need each other, and you need and I need them to understand that. So let's go back to the tax reform signing, the celebration. They're happy. They've succeeded. They've worked together, and instantly the entire mood on the congressional elections improves in their favor. But then 2 or 3 days after that, and a lot of this is Trump's fault, he's on to something else on the Twitter or whatever.
Right, yeah.
Republicans have one chance to win the midterms now, and that is to constantly remind people, if you like your tax cut, the only way you can keep it is to keep us in office, because this is all going away if we lose the House and the Senate. And by the way, Trump may go away if we lose the House and the Senate. So they need each other, and it just seems like both sides, and I'm kind of like caught in the middle, especially on internet message boards and stuff, where you have to be in one tribe or the other. Well, no, there's parts of both that I understand are part of any winning strategy, but if they don't ride tax reform and say, look, this is how we govern and how it improves your life, your job, your 401k, everything. If this is the difference between us in charge and the other guys in charge. And the voters don't have to like both or either. They just need to understand what is at stake. Mm-hmm. I don't know that that's going to happen, but that's how we could win the midterms, not just avoid disaster. It should be a good thing.
Right. But I mean, I'm worried about when I see, for example, in the special election in Pennsylvania, you see a little trick going on there in that the candidate, Connor Lamb, who won by, I think, less than 1%. I think he won by less than 1,000 votes. But nevertheless, he ran to the right of the Republican.
Yeah.
And he is like now whether or not this is just another hoax, and it probably is, pulled on the American people. As soon as he gets in there, he's going to tack back to probably who he is. It seems to me to be a strategy. The same thing true in the Alabama special election, even though Roy Moore was a horrible candidate. Nevertheless, his opponent ran as a conservative, and even though the guy's a flaming liberal, he ran as a conservative. He says he's going to be a conservative because that's a reflection of his state. And that, to me, is a troubling development. It seems like it's probably a coordinated plan on the part of the Democrats to basically, run like they're Trump without Trump.
Yeah, and right, and you're absolutely right in both of those cases. So let me say a couple things about special elections. When you have a shock presidential election, and we certainly had that in 2016, and to some extent we had that in 2008, there's always kind of a real hard backlash for the first year or so in these little special off-year elections,
right?
Because nothing energizes a base like getting smacked in the most recent election. So all these are, in addition to your very good point about the fact they're running like Joe Manchin Democrats, and Manchin runs like a Republican in West Virginia. Yeah, they're pulling that. And this goes back to shades of New York 23 a number of years ago. I'm sure you remember that. Mm-hmm. But the Republicans need to learn that. But they need to nationalize these elections, and they need to remind people, look, you could elect George Washington as a Democratic congressman, but all that's going to do is make Nancy Pelosi more powerful. It's not going to help us a bit. So right. Making Nancy Pelosi, making Chuck Schumer more powerful, which every single Democrat that gets elected does, that's not moving. It doesn't matter how conservative the candidate are. It matters about the leadership of the party. And right now, the Democratic leadership is way off the wacko left end. And going even further, so we need to nationalize the election around that, use tax reform and Obamacare as Exhibit A, Exhibit B, maybe immigration as Exhibit B or A or B. Remind people what the difference is between, the kind of policies that have turned Cuba and Venezuela into a hellhole versus the kind of policies that have Americans wanting to move to Texas and South Carolina and North Carolina and other red states.
No, I mean, I think you're very insightful in this way. We have to show that, put Nancy Pelosi and Schumer and maybe a couple of others up, call them the Gang of Four, and put up billboards on the highways of all major cities and say, look, this is the regime that you're going to be electing, and that some of these conservatives, they're going to turn left once they're in office. I mean, a good example of that is Kristen Gillibrand in New York. She ran as a conservative. She was pro-gun. She was anti-abortion. Once she's in office now, she's to the left of anyone in office. I mean, it's a hoax.
Right. Well, she has to be, because number one, if she isn't, she won't get any committee assignments from the Democrat leadership. And number two, it wouldn't matter if she voted a straight 100% conservative voting record. She makes Chuck Schumer more powerful by either narrowing his minority or giving him the majority. And Chuck Schumer is way left. And same thing in the House. I mean, leadership is what this is all about. I mean, watch House of Cards. The freshman congressman, that doesn't mean anything.
Right.
I mean, Heath Shuler ran as a conservative and won in the mountains of North Carolina a number of years ago. Then he was shocked to find out what he believed didn't matter, because
that's right. He could be assigned to the back bench. And by the way, Gillibrand has a very strong Republican opponent in Shel Farley. She's running. She's excellent. So you might want to take a look at her candidacy. And, I guess that there's, it's a combination of trying to brand the true nature of the Democrat Party, along with their embrace of Louis Farrakhan, the vicious anti-Semite, radical leftist, and try and point out that, yes, a vote for any of these people, you may like them locally, but, you're going to be putting them back in power. And the first thing they're going to do is they're going to impeach President Trump. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that.
Yep. And this is why Trump needs to understand that, look, I don't like Paul Ryan. I think Mitch McConnell is one of the most despicable people in Washington. But you know what? When they're up there smiling and just gave me a tax cut, I can deal with it.
Exactly.
I can deal with that a lot more than if Chuck Schumer's in power and he's going to take that tax cut away. And then, and there's not going to be the opposition from Ryan or McConnell that there needs to be to that. So, we need them to understand they need each other. And
right. Absolutely. We need to get them together, and we need to remind the American people that so they really want to go back to this old corrupt, system, of the Obama era. They should put him up on that Gang of Four also. Edmund, why don't we, because we're reaching toward the end of the program, I'd like you to take the opportunity to mention where people can read your column, get your books, and what you're up to.
Well, I still contribute from time to time for American Thinker. I do a lot of Newsmax TV interview bits and a couple of different programs over there. I was actually personally recruited to Breitbart by Steve Bannon based on my work on the Republican establishment. I ended up not being enthusiastic enough Trump supporter during the primaries to kind of pass muster at Breitbart. That universe was no longer interested in what I had to say, though I think I'll be back in there at some point.
Sure.
But the funny thing is, too, WTF, How Karl Rove and the Establishment Lost Again, which you can find on Amazon, is in some ways actually more applicable today than it was 5 years ago. I don't know if that means I was lucky or ahead of the curve or what.
Yeah, you're prophetic.
Yes, prophetic. Yeah. Okay, I'll use that.
There you go. All right, Edmund. Listen, I want to thank you very much for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you, Chuck. Appreciate it any time.
All right, and the program will be up on YouTube, so please subscribe to the YouTube channel and have a good day. Thank you.